Have you ever had the strange feeling that someone close to you isn't really happy for your success? Have you ever felt that behind a congrats, there was envy disguised as a smile? Well, maybe no one's told you this yet, but emotional danger doesn't always come from where you expect. Carl Jung once said that the shadow manifests not only within us, but also through others, especially those who pretend to love us while secretly rooting against us. It's a hard truth, but a necessary one. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one who attacks you, it's the one who claps with silent rage. And the worst part? Sometimes you call that enemy a friend, or even family. We live in a world where the ego has learned to disguise itself as kindness, where a smile hides a competitive glance, where "I'm so happy for you" sounds like an empty sentence, forced through clenched teeth. True spirituality, the kind that heals from the inside out, demands discernment, because while you keep giving, trusting, exposing your vulnerabilities, someone may be draining your light just to brighten their own darkness. And this video isn't just a warning, it's a key to help you see what your eyes can't, feel what your soul already knows, and break free from the bond that strangles while pretending to protect you. What if your biggest block isn't something missing inside, but a presence outside? What if your intuition has been trying to warn you, and you've been calling it an overreaction? The whisper of intuition. There are times when the world is just too loud to hear what's obvious, but intuition doesn't shout, it whispers. It slips through your breath, in that chill you can't explain, in the discomfort that shows up when everyone else seems just fine. Carl Jung said the unconscious speaks in symbols, and intuition is the soul's purest language. Most people spend their whole lives ignoring that whisper, trying to rationalize everything through the ego, that inner judge that demands proof, logic, guarantees. But intuition doesn't operate through logic. It speaks the language of ancestral wisdom, and if you always need certainty to take action, you'll end up stuck between fear and doubt. Intuition isn't the enemy of reason, it's the complement. Like a quiet compass pointing to what your eyes can't see. And if you quiet down inside, you'll realize it's been warning you, long before the fall. Some call it a gut feeling, others call it instinct. But whatever name you give it, that inner voice is what separates a life aligned from a life chained to chance. A practical example: ever been about to close a deal and suddenly your body freezes? Or had a strong urge to call someone, only to find out they needed you at that exact moment? That's more than coincidence. That's your soul trying to break through the mask of your persona, that social face you wear every day, often muffling your true perception. Doing shadow work also means learning to trust that subtle voice. Understanding that the archetype of the wise one doesn't just live in books, it lives inside you, waiting for the silence it needs to be heard. And no, intuition doesn't always bring comfort. Sometimes it points you straight to the place your ego most wants to avoid. You know that decision that feels totally irrational but brings you peace just thinking about it. That thing you can't explain yet can't ignore. That might be a spiritual calling. It's not about acting on impulse, but recognizing that not all wisdom comes from the mind. Carl Jung called this reconnection with the self, the true center of your psyche. And in a world flooded with other people's opinions, your intuition might be the only voice still speaking to your essence, and that's when the real conflict begins. Because once you truly start listening, you realize not everything that seems harmless really is. The shadow hiding in humor. Funny how laughter can mask a scream. There are people who make everyone laugh, but cry when they're alone. And it's not drama, it's defense. Carl Jung reminds us that whatever isn't embraced in the light ends up hiding in the shadow. And humor is often the perfect disguise for pain that's too deep to put into words. Ever noticed how some jokes feel like poison? How certain funny comments carry a sting of resentment? That's no accident. That's shadow masquerading as lightness. It's old pain that found a socially acceptable outlet through irony. The smiling persona doesn't reveal the wounded child underneath, the one who learned that being too serious meant being ignored. And the strange thing is, society applauds this persona. The funny one is always the life of the party, but few realize they're laughing to survive. Making jokes became an emotional shield, a way to avoid rejection and keep pain under control. But that kind of protection comes at a cost, disconnection from your true self. Shadow work here means looking at your automatic humor and asking, what am I avoiding feeling right now? Sometimes that joke about failure is really fear of never being enough. Sometimes the sarcasm about love is just a wall to avoid being hurt again. When you start paying closer attention to what you say, the ego starts to shake, because it knows it can't hide behind laughter anymore. There's a big difference between laughing with lightness and laughing as self-defense. Spirituality doesn't demand that you be serious all the time, but it does ask for truth. You can laugh and still be in touch with your pain. The real question is, does this laughter bring you closer to yourself or pull you away? Here's a simple but powerful exercise. Write down all the phrases you usually say as jokes. Then in silence, ask yourself, what is this covering up? You might be surprised by the answers. Carl Jung said, what you deny controls you. And sometimes your inner enemy isn't in dark thoughts. It's in the jokes you keep telling without realizing you're betraying yourself. And once you see that, it's impossible to unsee. The presence that sabotages. Sometimes the biggest saboteur in your life doesn't curse you, leave you, or humiliate you. They listen, they applaud, they even support you, but always with a slight delay. They're there, but never fully. They say they believe in you, but don't really share in your joy. They show up, but only when it suits them. Carl Jung teaches us that the shadow also hides in lukewarm bonds, in conditional affection, in support that takes more than it gives. And when you start to grow, these silent presences begin to reveal themselves, not through words, but through omission. These are the people who seem to want the best for you, but secretly feed off your stagnation. Because as long as you stay small, they feel bigger. This kind of energy doesn't scream, it drains. It's the look disguised as concern, the doubt that slips into your field pretending to be advice. Are you sure you can handle it? You really think this is the right time? And just like that, the ego plants those seeds and grows a whole forest of self-sabotage. The saboteur archetype isn't just a part of you. It also shows up in the relationships you tolerate, in the friend who compliments you but changes the subject when you shine, in the family that says, take it slow, when what you really needed was, go with faith. Shadow work here is brutal because it asks you to recognize that affection can be contaminated, that not every connection is a connection. Sometimes it's a prison with a smile. And the most dangerous part? Repetition. Because people who grew up surrounded by conditional love tend to normalize this kind of presence. You start getting used to relationships where almost is the ceiling, almost support, almost affection, almost truth. This is where spirituality brings a tough lesson. The one who sabotages you in silence might be closer than you think. And as long as you maintain those ties out of emotional loyalty, your soul will stay trapped at the same frequency. Carl Jung called this the family collective unconscious. And breaking free from it takes courage, because it means making room for emptiness before true applause arrives. But be careful. Not every applause warms the heart, and that's where the next deception lives. The applause that doesn't warm. Not every applause feeds you. Sometimes it just echoes the emptiness. Strange, right? You achieve, deliver, overcome, and still, when the eyes turn to you, your heart feels hollow. Carl Jung spoke about this symbolically. When it's the persona stepping onto the stage, it's the ego that receives the applause. But if the ones clapping don't truly know you, the recognition doesn't reach where it should. It stops at the surface. How many times have you craved validation, and when it finally came, it felt like nothing? That's not ingratitude. It's misalignment. You've been feeding a character, and the problem with the character is it never feels loved, only praised. Because for the persona, love is always conditional on performance, and it starts early. The child who only got affection for getting good grades, the teenager who was only seen when they made others laugh, the adult who learned how to perform, but not how to express themselves. The ego loves that. It lives for the spotlight. But the self longs for connection. Spirituality teaches that true warmth doesn't come from applause. It comes from presence, from being at peace with who you are, even when no one's watching. Here's a powerful exercise. Reflect on what truly warms your heart. When was the last time you felt full without needing to impress anyone? If it takes a while to answer, maybe it's time to shift your focus from outward performance to inner essence. And the most challenging part? When applause becomes an addiction, when you don't even know who you are anymore without the likes, the recognition, the wow, you're amazing. Carl Jung called this a possession by the persona, when the mask clings so tightly to your face that you forget what your real smile looks like. And at that point, no matter how loud the cheers, your soul stays cold. Because winning means nothing if you lost yourself along the way. That's when the journey begins to shift. Because maybe what you need isn't more applause, but more silence. And in that silence, a new kind of care begins to grow. But care, too, can become a cage. The care that cages you. There's a kind of care that doesn't nurture, it suffocates. It's wrapped in good intentions, dressed up with phrases like, "It's for your own good," "I just want to protect you," "I know you better than you know yourself." And little by little, that care becomes a cage. Carl Jung said, the ego has a deep need to control what it fears losing. And when that control disguises itself as care, the prison goes unnoticed. Sometimes, the one who says they love you most is the one who least allows you to grow, because your growth threatens their emotional comfort. So yes, they care, but they care just enough to keep you exactly where you are. And the worst part? You thank them for it. It's a kind of care that defines you, limits you, suffocates you. The kind that says, that's not like you. You won't be able to handle it. Better not try right now. And you believe it, because it comes from someone you love. But that love is shaped by fear. Fear of change, fear of you breaking the mold, fear of you flying higher. Spirituality invites us to discern. Not all care is love. Sometimes it's just someone else's ego disguised as affection. Shadow work here is painful because it forces you to question how you learned to be loved. Are you calling it love when it's really control? Are you mistaking safety for stagnation? And the most painful part, this kind of care rarely comes from a bad place. It often comes from parents, partners, friends, people who were also cared for this way. It's a transgenerational pattern, a family archetype that repeats itself unnoticed. Carl Jung talked about complexes, psychic structures we inherit that shape our behavior without us realizing it. And when care becomes a cell, it takes courage to open the door. That might mean disappointing people, saying no where you used to say yes. But that's the price of emotional freedom. And once you begin to free yourself, you'll see that not all chains are made of metal. Some are made of silence, and that silence sometimes hurts more than a scream, because there's an absence that cuts deeper than any word. The tongue that stabs in absence. Not every wound comes from spoken words. Sometimes it's born from what was never said, from silence that weighs more than any shout. Carl Jung said that what is repressed doesn't disappear, it just changes form. And in many relationships, the attack isn't direct. It comes through omission, through "we'll talk later," through "it's nothing," through the glance that avoids, the touch that never comes, the presence that doesn't embrace. The tongue can hurt without uttering a single word, because absence, when intentional, is a brutal choice. It's the ego saying, "You're not important enough to deserve my attention." And the most treacherous part of this silence is how hard it is to prove. How do you confront someone who hurts you by what they don't do? How do you explain the pain of not being heard when no one stopped you from speaking? This is the kind of wound shadow work uncovers and resists the most, because the one affected starts doubting their own pain. Am I overreacting? Am I being too sensitive? But no. The silence that wounds is not neutral absence, it's strategic absence. It's the shadow manipulating affection. It's distorted spirituality posing as emotional superiority. And if you're living this, you need a radar more sensitive than hearing, the radar of the soul. The solution? It starts with validation, acknowledging that what wasn't said still speaks. That absence is also a language, and some languages kill slowly. Carl Jung said the unconscious is a place where everything speaks, even the silence. So yes, there is a kind of silence that wounds, that humiliates, that diminishes. And identifying it is an act of individuation, an inner cry that refuses to accept emotional neglect as normal. Because sometimes the greatest violence isn't in harsh words, but in calculated absence. And when you finally see that, you begin to realize that some victories are actually disguised defeats. The failure of your victory. Not every victory is a true success. Some people reach the top and feel empty. They achieve what they always dreamed of, only to realize it wasn't what their soul actually wanted. Carl Jung warned that when we follow a path dictated only by the ego, we're bound to stumble into the shadow, even when we appear to be winning. Because there's a kind of failure that doesn't scream, but corrodes from within, the failure of climbing the right ladder, leaning against the wrong wall. Have you ever stopped to ask yourself how many of your achievements came from a fear of rejection, from a need to prove yourself, to please an inner figure that's never satisfied? That's the kind of victory that looks great in photos, but feels bitter in your chest. People congratulate you, you smile, say thank you, but deep down, you feel like you betrayed yourself. True spirituality invites you to revisit those victories. To ask, is this really mine, or does it belong to my persona? Because often what the world calls success is just a beautifully crafted escape from pain. How many doctors, lawyers, influencers, entrepreneurs regret in silence, living a life that looks perfect but lacks soul? It's as if the self was left behind the moment the ego chose the right path. And the hardest part? The fear of letting go. Because now there's status, comfort, expectations from others. But what no one tells you is that keeping a life that doesn't represent you is a daily symbolic suicide. Carl Jung called this the individuation crisis, a breaking point where the soul starts screaming louder than the applause. And you know what makes it worse? Realizing your body had been trying to warn you all along. The signs were there. The soul never stopped whispering. And it's through the body that this truth starts to speak the loudest. The body that doesn't lie. The body speaks before the mind can understand. Carl Jung said that whatever isn't brought to consciousness reappears as fate. And often, the body is the first messenger of that fate, disguised as pain, that lingering backache, the insomnia that visits even after an exhausting day, that fatigue doctors can't explain. While the ego tries to rationalize, the body screams. Because the body doesn't lie. It's the stage where forgotten emotions perform. The most raw and direct way for the unconscious to show you something's out of place. It carries what your voice couldn't say and what your soul got tired of repeating in silence. How many times have you felt unwell in spaces that had no reason? That sudden nausea in a meeting, the headache just from thinking about seeing someone, the heaviness in your chest when returning home. That's not drama, it's wisdom. Your body is picking up what your mind hasn't yet processed. Jung said that repressed psychic energy doesn't vanish. It finds symbolic ways to emerge, and the body, as a direct channel between the self and the world, turns this invisible content into symptoms. That's why shadow work isn't just about looking at past trauma. It's about listening to the body's messages with humility, and sometimes the message is clear. You're not where you're meant to be. Here's a practical example. Start mapping your physical pain. Grab a notebook and write daily what you felt in your body and in what context. After a week, read it carefully. You'll begin to see patterns, situations that drain you, people who cause tension, activities that bring lightness. This isn't just self-help, it's embodied spirituality. Because while you're looking for signs in the sky, your body is handing you internal maps. And once you start honoring this biological compass, the path of individuation becomes clearer. And maybe the strongest sign your soul is awakening is when your body starts to heal. But be careful, the soul's awakening isn't a show. It usually happens in silence, when no one else is around. The soul that awakens alone. The soul's awakening rarely happens with an audience. It arrives quietly, between unseen tears, sleepless nights, and questions no one else can answer for you. Carl Jung said the individuation process is deeply solitary, not because the soul is isolated, but because not everyone is willing to go deep. And here's the paradox. The more you come to know yourself, the more you realize that many of your relationships only existed to sustain who you were pretending to be. So the awakening begins with pain. The pain of realizing that constant company was never the same as true connection. That's the moment when spirituality stops being a pretty concept and becomes a lived experience. You start pulling away from empty conversations, places that don't nourish you, ties that take more than they give. And yes, it's scary. The ego will say you're isolating yourself. It'll call you ungrateful, too intense, too complicated. But that's the price of clarity, because once the soul wakes up, it no longer accepts emotional crumbs. It starts craving purpose, meaning, truth. And everything that's superficial starts to crumble. It's as if the outside world can no longer hold the frequency of your new inner state. You begin to walk more lightly, but also more silently. But that silence isn't empty, it's fertile. It's in the silence that new connections are born, with people, ideas, and experiences vibrating on the same wavelength. Carl Jung called this synchronicity, meaningful encounters that seem like chance, but are actually responses from the unconscious. And once the soul awakens, it starts attracting exactly what it needs to keep going. But the curious part, sometimes that journey begins in an unlikely place, the end, because there are loves, projects, identities that only come to life when you're brave enough to let the old ones go. And in that ending, a new beginning is born. The love that begins at the end. Some loves aren't born in the meeting, but in the breaking. Carl Jung said that what wounds us most can also heal us if we're willing to look within. And sometimes it's only at the end of a relationship that you finally learn how to love yourself. Because while you were there, you gave so much, bent so much, that you lost yourself. And only after the silence, the absence, the emptiness, does your own voice start to return. Spirituality isn't about holding on to everything, it's about releasing what no longer serves. And when the ego goes quiet, the self begins to speak. And what it often says is, you weren't born to beg for love. The kind of love that begins at the end is different. It's mature, calm, quiet. It doesn't shout promises or demand guarantees. It blooms when you stop trying to fit where you never belonged. It's the kind of love that starts when you no longer need saving, because you've realized no one can save you from yourself. Carl Jung described the reunion with the self as the true return home. And that reunion only happens when pain stops being a distraction and becomes a teacher. When external abandonment reveals internal abandonment. When missing the other turns into missing yourself. And that's when a new way of loving begins to rise, softer, more honest, freer. This love doesn't need to be returned to be real because it doesn't depend on the other. It starts within. It's the kind of love that doesn't fill a void. It overflows from essence, that doesn't need control or eternal promises, because it understands that love is letting the other be, without it threatening who you are. Shadow work is essential here. To look at all your neediness disguised as romance, your demands dressed up as care, your control masked as concern. Once you see these shadows, love stops being a battlefield and becomes a space for healing. And maybe that's why when everything ends, something finally begins. And now tell me, how many times have you felt something was off but chose to stay quiet? How many times have you doubted the look beside you but told yourself it was just your imagination? The truth is, many people spend their whole lives surrounded and still feel alone, because presence without truth is still abandonment. Carl Jung reminds us, what you deny controls you. And as long as you keep normalizing bonds that wound in silence, your soul will keep crying out for freedom in places that only offer prison. But this journey doesn't end here. That thing you felt, that discomfort, that click, that I relate to this, is just the beginning. Because in the next video, we're going even deeper into the anatomy of spiritually dangerous relationships. We're going to talk about healers who harm, support that keeps you small, mirrors that distort your reflection. And believe me, once you see it, there's no unseeing it. So here's what to do. If this video touched you in any way, if you felt on any level that it spoke to you, subscribe to the channel now. Turn on notifications like someone tuning in to their favorite sacred show, because here, every episode is a mirror. Every topic is an invitation to clarity. The shadow may be heavy, but you are not alone in this journey.